Man, I'll tell you what, over the last couple of weeks, the NHL has really started to take this whole parity and unpredictability thing very seriously. And the top 10 teams are certainly no exception to that, so here we are again for another set of NHL Power Rankings, now 7 weeks into the season. Now, I will say that most of that chaos in this week's video is in the form of teams moving up and down this list all over the place, rather than a bunch of new teams showing up, as there is only one new team that wasn't in last week's video in this one, and they're in an honorable mention slot, where there's only one team that moved up from an honorable mention last week into this top 10. With those honorable mentions, though, I'll start with the team that we saw last week in the DC Capitals. Now, for the Capitals, they would still be on this list if they just taken care of business against the Oilers, and honestly might still be in the 10th slot if they just kept it close, but instead they got shut out 5-0. And look, I get that even in spite of how they started the season, this Oilers team is still very, very offensively talented. I mean, 5 goals is still kind of a lot, but it's much more the 0 goals that the Capitals were able to score on one of the worst defensive and goaltending teams in the NHL that's a little bit more concerning, and what bumps them down out of this top 10. And to be perfectly honest, I thought about giving this honorable mention slot to the Flyers, one, because it's not necessarily the 10th and 11th ranked teams if I were to continue this top 10, it's just teams I feel like are worth mentioning, and the Flyers had been doing pretty well. They did, however, lose 2 of their 3 games this week, even if one was to a very good opponent that we'll see on this list towards the top of it, but they did lose 2 out of 3, and the only reason they're actually ahead of DC in the standings is because they've played 4 more games. My second honorable mention, and again, not necessarily the team that I would rank 11th, is a team that I don't think has actually shown up in one of these yet to this point, but is very much a team that seems to be on the rise, and with the return of their star goaltender, could find their way into this top 10 pretty quick with another hot week or two. That being the Tampa Bay Lightning. Now, for the Lightning, they did have a pretty good week, going 2-0-1, playing all 3 games against teams that we'll see on this list, and their last and most recent win was a pretty decisive 8-2 win over Carolina. Really, the only reason they're not on the list right now is because they had a bit of a climb to make to get to this spot in the first place after a shaky start to the season, which is understandable being without Vasilevsky. But now that he's back, well, if that first game back for him was any indication, the 8-2 win over Carolina, considering they have 4 games this week, they could find their way into this top 10 as early as this time next week. But as we get into the top 10, in that 10th slot, at least for now anyway, I have the Carolina Hurricanes. Now yes, again, the Hurricanes did just lose 8-2 to the team I just mentioned, but the reason they're still in this 10th slot and not an honorable mention instead of the Lightning is because of that ground the Lightning had to make up. Plus, at least for the Canes, they did win their other 2 games of the week, even if they weren't the most impressive wins in the world. A 6-3 win against a bad Oilers team, and that's part of the reason they're actually in this slot instead of the team that got shut out by the Oilers 5-0, as well as finishing off the week with a not terribly impressive 3-2 win against a not terribly good Blue Jackets team. Still, this is very much a Carolina team that I think is a lot better than their record suggests, and they have a pretty decent record at that. They just kind of haven't been playing the full 60 minutes as consistently as I think they will as we get into the deeper parts of the season. Up next at number 9, I have another team who started their week off by beating the Oilers, this time 5-3, in the Florida Panthers. Now, the Panthers, who end up moving down this week, had every opportunity to move up this list, but they end up losing their next 2 games against good opponents who we have yet to get to, in the Boston Bruins, who they lost to 3-1, and the Winnipeg Jets, who they got shut out by 3-0. So, not necessarily the best losses, even if they were against good teams, and as a result, the Panthers do slide down a bit, because even if I'm not going to punish them a ton for losing to good teams, I do have to punish them a little bit, and it proves that they're not quite ready for the top 5 type of area, like both of those teams are at least competing for, if not already in. The Panthers, though, aren't the only team that slid down this list from last week, as both of the next 2 teams that I have in 7th and 8th have done so as well. And honestly, I thought about flip-flopping these 2 a couple of times, but in the end, in 8th place, I've gone with the Dallas Stars. Now, the Stars did start off their week with a very impressive win, 6-3 over the New York Rangers. Unfortunately, since that game, the week for those 2 teams went in very opposite directions. Not only from each other, but also from the outcome of that game. Well, when I say unfortunately, I mean unfortunately for the Stars, as they would lose each of their next 2 games in the week. The first one in overtime to a team that we have yet to get to on this list, a 2-1 loss to the Vegas Golden Knights, but then they lost 7-4 to the Calgary Flames. So it was partially that had me bump them down to this 8th spot rather than in 7th, even in spite of that impressive win to start the week off. Though with that being said, the team that I have above them in 7th, and again, could be convinced to swap them with, also finished their week with a pretty embarrassing loss. Although it was just a 1-goal loss, it was to the San Jose Sharks. Because in 7th, I do have the Vancouver Canucks. Now, for the Canucks, another part of the reason that they stay in the 7th slot and don't drop down to 8th is because I felt dropping them all the way from 4th to 8th, so they did have farther to fall to get here, was a little bit harsh for a team that did still go 2-2 on the week, even if their strength of schedule wasn't great outside of the Colorado Avalanche, who they lost 5-2 against. Besides, while it is still embarrassing to lose to the Sharks regardless of any other circumstances surrounding it, they did also start their week by beating the Sharks 3-1. So I guess it kind of evens out in the end, although I'm not sure there's really any evening out for a loss to this Sharks team this season. They did also beat the Kraken, who they lost to last week, 5-1, and yeah, that was not a fun game to be at as a Kraken fan, but it is what it is. Now, I will also say that between these two teams, the Canucks and Stars, I still think I believe a little bit more in the Stars as this season goes along. The Canucks, though, did have that incredible start to the season, and while they have found a little bit more rockier roads in these last couple of weeks, at best they've fallen to a team that's just unpredictable, but definitely not bad quite yet. And either way, that hot start should carry them for the foreseeable future, and I wouldn't imagine that they're outside the top 10 come next week, but a loss to Anaheim and Calgary could get them there. Still, I certainly wouldn't expect that to happen, and if anything, I doubt that Quinn Hughes would allow it, who, outside of Cale Makar, is certainly the leading candidate for the Norris at this point. It's pretty much him and Makar, a 2-horse race for now, but there's still plenty of season left. And while yes, Pettersson has slowed down his scoring a little bit, JT Miller and Brock Besser are still keeping up their offense, and with Hronek joining them on the defensive end, that is 5 players that they now have at a point per game pace here, a little bit over a quarter of the way through the season. And if even a few of them can keep that up with what Demko's doing in net, they should have no trouble at least treading water into the playoffs off of that hot start. And then in the 6th slot, all the way up from 10th last week, I have the Winnipeg Jets. And they would have probably ended up being 5th if it wasn't for the loss to the Predators here on Sunday. They did at least win their other 2 games of the week, both against teams that I've already mentioned, both from Florida, winning in overtime against Tampa Bay 3-2, and then shutting out the Panthers, like I already mentioned, 3-0. Now, with the Jets, yes, a 4-place jump off of a 2-1 week does seem like a lot, and I guess in some ways it kind of is a quarter of the way through the season, especially considering neither of their wins were against top 3 teams on this list. I mean, I did mention both of them already, but they were towards the bottom or an honorable mention, and their loss was to a mediocre Nashville team that is on a hot streak, but did not start their season particularly well. All that said, though, this has not been a 1-week thing for the Jets either. They jumped all the way into the top 10 last week after having not been mentioned to that point, and now over their last 10 games, they're sitting at 8-2, even with that loss to Nashville. So this still very much is one of the hottest teams in the NHL, and for what it's worth, they are a top 10 team both in goals for per game and goals against per game. Not something that every team on this list, including a couple that I have yet to get to, can say to this point. Plus, for what it's worth, and it could be worth a whole lot if it continues, although he didn't have the best start to the season, I mean, not terrible, but not great by his standards, Hellebuck has really started to come on here, and this team is still scoring at about that same rate. And I remember, at least early on, it seemed like this team was Hellebuck getting hot away from becoming one of the better teams in the NHL. Sure enough, Hellebuck's gotten hot, and here we are. And then in the 5th spot, and it's a tenuous 5th place at that, I still have the Vegas Golden Knights, who are largely here because of that incredible start to the season they had, and the faltering of a lot of teams that were above them or around them last week. Now, Winnipeg's very close to catching them, and like I said, probably would have if it wasn't for that loss to the Predators. But for the Golden Knights, it isn't looking great here over the last 10 games, where in their last 10, they have the same 4-5-1 record that the San Jose Sharks have in that same span, which, I mean, for the Sharks is actually kind of incredible, but it also says quite a bit about how things have been going for Vegas in that span as well. And to be perfectly honest, it might even be worse than that record would suggest, as in their last 9 games, they've scored 2 or fewer goals in 6 of them. And one of the games that's an outlier there, one of those other 3, was a 5-0 win over the San Jose Sharks. Now, Vegas did win one of those mentioned games, 2-1 in overtime against the Stars this week, but even at that, and with how well the combination of Hill and Thompson have been playing to this point in the season, scoring that few that consistently is just not going to be sustainable. Now, I still do think that Vegas will get this figured out, and it won't be a lasting problem that they have for too big of a chunk of the season. But if it turns out to be, this is a team that could find a way to spiral their way into maybe a wild card type of position. At least for now, though, they are still leading the Pacific Division, and while these last couple of weeks have shown that there might be some vulnerabilities with this team, all of their losses have come in that span, and the start of the season did show that when they have things rolling, they can be an absolutely unstoppable force. So, it's just up to them to decide which one they want to be for the rest of the year. With that, though, we now get into the top four, where if this was college football, where only 4 teams make the playoffs, at least for right now anyway, and those 4 teams are determined by a combination of the standings and arbitrary rankings, it would not be too hard to determine who the top 4 teams in the NHL are, as I do think there's a bit of a gap between these 4 and the rest of the field. I've said that before, and that gap closes then the following week, so who knows what'll happen in a week's time, but at least for right now, these are very much the 4 best teams. And up first, in the 4th spot, I have the Colorado Avalanche, who, a few weeks ago, did go through a lot of the same things that Vegas seems to be going through right now, although it didn't last as long for the Avalanche, and over the last couple, they've worked their way all the way back to being clearly one of the best teams in the NHL, winning 7 of their last 10, and 6 of their last 7. So although Colorado's week did start off with that 4-3 loss to the Nashville Predators, where they gave up 2 goals in the final minute to lose it 4-3, they did then follow that up with 3 straight wins, beating Vancouver pretty bad 5-2, and then took care of business with a 3-2 win against the Wild and a 3-1 win against the Flames. Even with just 3 goals in each of those last 2 games, they still sit 3rd in the NHL in goals for per game, just under 4 per game, and this is very much a team that knows how to put the puck in the net. And that's even with McKinnon still sitting at just 7 goals on the season, which you'd have to think is gonna pick up here at some point. And if they can play this well and score this much without their best offensive threat really contributing as much as they're used to, that bodes pretty well for the rest of their season going forward. Now, obviously, it helps that Makar is making his bid for another Norris with 30 points through 20 games, but even at that, only 5 of those points are goals, so he still has some goal scoring that he could catch up with as well. And for what it's worth with the Avalanche, unlike teams like Vancouver or Vegas, who in previous weeks I mentioned that their underlying 5-on-5 expected stats weren't necessarily fantastic and certainly didn't suggest that they're as good as their records would suggest, Vancouver is at least now north of the average when it comes to preventing goals, but still very much south of the offensive end in spite of their offensive production. Either way, with Colorado, those stats would also very much suggest that this is one of the 4 best teams in the league. So all that to say, this is not a team that I would be expecting to see falling off again anytime soon. Now, if you do happen to like all of those advanced stats and extra underlying metrics, 5-on-5 expected goals against, all that good stuff, then the team that I have in 3rd place is a team that you very well may see, like a lot of those stats do, as the best team in the NHL, at least right now. That being the LA Kings. Now, the Kings, again, by most of those stats, are the best team in the NHL, and at least over the last 10 games, I'm not sure I disagree. I mean, at least when it comes to expected goals at 5-on-5, both for and against, they're currently the 2nd best team in the NHL at preventing offense coming towards them, and the 3rd best in the NHL at creating offense the other way. And even outside of what the advanced stats say, when it comes to actual goals for and against per game, they are tied with the Canucks for most goals in the NHL per game with 4 per game. And unlike the Canucks, again, they have that advanced stat thing to back up that it's not necessarily them just getting a whole ton of crazy luck like maybe the Canucks have gotten, especially in that hot start to the season they had. Meanwhile, it's pretty much the same story back at their end of the ice, where they currently sit 2nd best in the NHL to just the New York Rangers, and they're pretty close there to 1st at 2.37 goals given up per game. So yeah, when you're scoring more than a goal and a half per game than you're giving up, it's not hard to see how that leads to a lot of success for this team. And with the 8-1-1 record that they have over their last 10, it's definitely been there. And again, with the advanced stat side of things, you can choose to believe in them or not. They're certainly not perfect. Few stats in hockey really are because of the nature of the game. But for what it's worth, they do point to the fact that this is very much who the Kings are. It's not some sort of random outperforming of how they're actually playing or anything like that. They are just this good. And I mean, again, for what it's worth, with the advanced stats, they did suggest that early on in the season, both Vancouver and Vegas were very much outperforming how they were actually playing on the ice. And sure enough, here both those teams are over the last couple of weeks with differing levels of rocky road, but Yeah, both of them has started to stumble a little bit. And speaking of teams that have started to stumble here a little bit, in second place I have the Boston Bruins, who did just lose 3 of their 4 games this week, one of them in overtime to Tampa Bay. But either way, not the best week from a team that has been, over the course of the season, above average at scoring goals, but fantastic at preventing them. However, this week, they end up giving up 5 goals to Tampa Bay in the 5-4 overtime loss, then do win 3-1 against Florida, but then give up 5 goals to Detroit and 7 to the New York Rangers. So, while it's not necessarily something I would expect to continue or happen all that frequently over the course of the rest of the season, the team that had been pretty much consistently giving up 2 goals every game really let up the floodgates a little bit over these last 7 days. And honestly, I thought about dropping them down to 3rd and putting LA above them, but it seemed a little bit weird to have a team that's not even technically leading their division at this point in the 2nd spot. So for at least now, the Bruins do stay with still the 2nd best record in the NHL in this 2nd spot, but it is a team that should probably try to figure out things on the offensive end and not just rely on that duo of Swayman and Ullmark to keep every puck that comes out of them out of the net to win every game that they play. I mean, I probably could have found a way to say that better, but either way, the point is this is a team that, unlike last year's record-setting team, is not scoring at nearly that same rate. Last year, their 3.66 goals per game over the course of the regular season was 2nd best in the NHL, as opposed to this season, where about a quarter of the way through, they're sitting outside the top 10 in 12th with a 3.40 goals per game, which is less than a quarter goal per game difference, but that does add up over time. And for a team that had some concerns coming into the season about the potential downgrades they made on their roster from last year, it's possible that that's starting to show through a little bit, at least on the offensive end. Now, to be clear, I am by no means saying that this is a bad or even mediocre team by any stretch of the imagination. They are still one of the better teams in the NHL, especially defensively, but I'm suggesting that this is not going to necessarily be a team that continues the rate that they've been winning games like they did last season. Of course, I think pretty much everyone had that same thought a year ago, and we all know what happened the rest of the year, so who knows? Though I suppose for what it's worth, the Bruins have now already lost, as of this week, their first regulation game at home, and that took them until January last year when they lost it to the Kraken. Which is really just something I wanted to work in there, that the Kraken beat the Bruins in January when nobody seemed to at home. Anyway, what I do know, at least right now anyway, at the Thanksgiving break, which, again, around 77% of the time predicts which teams are going to be in the playoffs and which ones aren't, right now the best team in the NHL is the New York Rangers. And yes, Rangers fans have been in the comments for the last couple of weeks saying that they have had the Rangers at number 1 for a while now, which, fair enough, you're a fan of the team, but they finally proved it here this week, and certainly with the last game of this week beating the Boston Bruins, the last week's best team, 7-4. Now, already at that point, I probably was going to put the Rangers over the Bruins, but that certainly sealed it. Now, again, it wasn't a perfect week for the Rangers either, as they did start off the week with that 6-3 loss against the Stars that I already mentioned when we talked about Dallas. And like I said then, the week did go in pretty opposite directions from there for both of these teams, as the Rangers would win all 3 of their next 3 games, even if the next 2 weren't necessarily the most convincing, with a 1-0 win over Pittsburgh and then a 3-1 win over Philadelphia. But the last win really was the statement one there over Boston, 7-4, like I've already said. Now, I will say with the Rangers, the offensive end of things still is a bit of a question mark for me, at least as far as best teams in the NHL are concerned. And even with them being just around the top third as far as goals for per game are concerned, they're actually below average when it comes to expected goals at 5-on-5. Either way, they are good enough defensively and certainly in net to more than make up for that, but it did show up a little bit in those first 3 games of the week where they scored just 7 goals across those 3 games. Of course, again, they do show up in bursts, at least with another 7 goals in just 1 game against the Bruins, but it's not necessarily the most reliable thing to have those bursts of offense every few games. Again, though, defensively, when it comes to preventing pucks from going in their net, this is the best team in the NHL, giving up just 2.32 goals per game. Obviously, their jump into first there is also thanks to the week that the Bruins had, but either way, this has been, for most of this season, one of the best teams at keeping the puck out of their net. Now, the expected 5-on-5 stats might suggest that they've been overperforming there as well, because they're just kind of above average when it comes to that. but some of that could probably be explained by the goaltending they've been getting, where really both of their goaltenders have been absolutely fantastic to this point in the season. Shesterkin, through 11 starts, has been borderline a top 10 goaltender in his own right, but it's really been the revenge tour of Jonathan Quick that has been incredible to watch from this team, who in the 8 games he's played for the Rangers has been one of the absolute best goaltenders in the NHL, right up there with Demko, Hill, and surprisingly Talbot for the Kings. So I suppose in that way, the Kings, especially with how they've been playing, maybe not missing Quick so much. I mean, maybe the fans miss him a little bit, but either way, since he left the Kings, things have been going pretty well for Jonathan Quick. Obviously getting a cup ring last year with the Golden Knights, and now this incredible start to his season in New York. Meanwhile, for the Rangers as a whole, even with still some offensive question marks, at least for me anyway, this is very much right now the best team in the NHL. And at least with the relatively light next week coming up, I don't think that's likely to change in a week's time. Of course, in 2 weeks' time, they get their first matchup against that Kings team, and that could really be an interesting game to watch coming up on December 10th. For now, though, with that, I'll leave it to you in the comment section to decide what I got wrong and what I got right about this list, who your top 10s would be. If you think there's a team that should have been number 1 that wasn't, Rangers fans for a couple weeks have been saying that was the Rangers, and now here they are, so time to defend it, I suppose. And otherwise, if you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below to help support the channel, so I'd appreciate you using them. Until next time, stay safe out there, be good to each other, God bless, and I guess the Kraken are at least in a playoff spot, largely because the rest of the West sucks outside of those top 6 teams, but you'll take it.